let's get to this ownership side of the equation now, because I think the ownership side is like so incredibly interesting to me. I think that this CBA above all showed that there are like two groups of owners, like the haves in terms of financial flexibility and market size, and the have nots. And I feel like what we learned from this negotiation is there are more have nots than there are haves in the league, because otherwise some of these stipulations that have gone through would not have gone through at the end of the day.
Yeah, and this was clear, like that they wanted to curtail themselves, right? Like this was the owners again trying to almost like make it make it more equitable across the board for themselves, even maybe to their own detriment a little bit, right? Like the thing that we have to remember is that when someone goes into the luxury tax, especially at the level that the Warriors and the Clippers have been, the teams that don't go there are getting paid out, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
not in the tax, you get money for it too. So, this is them trying to build a more equitable playing ground. I mean, I think there's a very strong argument to make that like spending a lot of money is not as huge a benefit to winning as you think it is. Certainly, it's a leg up. Like as always, having more money will help you in whatever field you're in. But like, if you look at the last 10 years, and I did this morning actually, the last 10 years of the teams that were top three in the league in payroll each season, they had 5 titles and 9 conference finals appearances among them, right? Which seems like a lot, definitely half the titles. When you look at it, it's the teams with LeBron and the Warriors, or it's the only other team that made it was the Thunder, which built internally anyway with Kevin Durant and Russell Westbrook, right? So like all the teams that tried to just microwave a roster by spending a crap ton of money all at once didn't get anything for it.
Yep.
And I think when you're trying to create more equity across the board in terms financially, a level playing field may not be what some of these owners want, because then you're
Yeah.
blaming your money and your ability to spend money and your own, and it becomes a case of your own competency. That's not necessarily a good thing. We've seen that over and over.
I was like pretty staggered by some of the decisions made in that regard. Like it feels a little bit crazy to me, even on the player side, to agree to situations where we're stopping the Clippers and Warriors from like profligate spending. You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, what that probably does is it decreases the amount that teams will spend on all of this, right? The fact that the Clippers are spending an exorbitant amount of money, Steve Ballmer might be rich enough to where he's just like, fuck it, I don't care. Like, go to hell, everybody else. I don't know that the Warriors will do that. Like, the Warriors are now in an incredibly interesting situation this offseason where it becomes harder for them to retain all of their roster following the Jordan Poole extension, with Draymond Green's free agency coming up, the Andrew Wiggins extension. Klay Thompson, I believe, is out of contract at the end of this season. Stephen Curry's enormous cap number, which is well earned. Like there is now a lot that shifts for them in terms of what they may or may not have been planning, in a way that like I think is concerning for a team like that, where they frankly now need to make like a fairly real and sizable playoff run in order to get like the gate revenue from their home games in order to potentially retain their team. It's a fascinating group of decisions here. And I really just think it's absurd to penalize ownership groups that are actually willing to spend. Like if you're willing to pay and you're willing to do it, fucking let these owners do it. Like we shouldn't be putting limits on owners paying players. The players are the product here, not the fucking teams that build the teams.
Well, but like in the end, so this becomes like two things, right? Like the players in this case, I understand why they would agree to this, because their BRI split remains the same. They're going to get paid either way. It really affects, like, I don't know, if we're talking about 3 teams per year above that second apron, right? And in terms of who will actually get paid, and can assume like the last 5 guys on the roster are minimum guys or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about 30 jobs. The stars will get paid either way. And if you can't re-sign with the Warriors or the Clippers and they want to re-sign you, you probably can get a contract somewhere else. And all these other structures in the new CBA are going to make it easier for you to get paid somewhere else too, right? Like, because there's a bigger mid-level, there's a bigger, bigger other kinds of exceptions, right? And so it doesn't affect their wholesale ability. It just makes it harder for teams like the Warriors and the Clippers and, let's say the Nets before this season to keep their teams together. But I don't think it's going to make it harder for players to get paid. It just might make it harder for players to get paid by like those two individual teams. And that to me is understandable why they make that trade off.
Well, or by the teams they want to stay with. Like if you're Draymond
Or
Green
the
and you want to stay with
yeah,
the Warriors, like this now may be a thing where it becomes a problem for him. And like instead of him going
yeah,
to the Warriors, he now has to go to the Rockets or something like that if he wants to, maximize his spending long term. Which like
sure,
I don't know how much Draymond cares about that. It seems like he's about to get an enormous amount of money from Warner Brothers or TNT, whatever place he decides to go work after basketball, because Draymond Green is incredibly intelligent and incredibly good at talking about basketball, far better than either you or I will ever be at this thing. So
hmm
like he has a long career ahead of him, but if you're Klay Thompson and you probably don't have a long career ahead of you talking, because it doesn't seem like you're interested in doing it as much as Draymond Green is, that becomes interesting in terms of where your future goes. And then the other part of this is, like you said, it affects 3 teams over that second apron. What I would say is that it actually impacts 6 teams currently in the league that are above that second apron level. So the Clippers and Warriors are 2 of them, but like Milwaukee is the 3rd team, right? Milwaukee is not what you consider like an enormous market. Milwaukee is just paying to keep this core together because they think they owe it to the players and because they want to win. And I don't
yeah,
think we should be limiting Milwaukee by doing this. And look, you look at the other 3 teams like Boston, Dallas, Phoenix, 3 other like sizable markets, right? 5 of these 6 teams are sizable markets. But like you look at Milwaukee, you look at a team like Oklahoma City, like down the road. I don't know. Like I feel I get why we're doing this. And I get it's the ultimate goal of all of this. It feels like is to increase parity, right? It feels
yeah,
like the owners wanted to go more down the road of like an NBA or an NFL driven model where every team can win every season potentially, right? Or at least, look, the Texans are not going to win the NFL Super Bowl next year, but in 2 years, we've seen turns like that before, right? Like Jacksonville went from a disaster in the Urban Meyer era to making the playoffs in Doug Peterson's first year. And then if they have a good offseason, you could see them theoretically making the Super Bowl next year. Like you can turn things a little bit quicker in the NBA now or in the NFL now. It feels like that's what they're trying to do in the NBA, is trying to reduce the number of super teams that thus then basically make the league non-competitive.
The interesting thing to me about this is like the way that they did this, right, to punish the higher spending teams, the higher spending owners, is that they could have just done this by just increasing tax penalties, right? For the teams in the tax or the teams above the second apron or the first apron, like however you want to structure it. You could have done this like purely just by putting in more punitive financial measures, right? As a disincentive for a team like the Warriors spending into the like bajillions of dollars next season, right? They decided to do it by making it harder to build a basketball team, which to me kind of maybe shows the split between some of these owners in that some care a lot more about the basketball aspect of this, and the ones that maybe don't care as much about winning are wanting and willing to punish those owners that do care. That's just my assumption.
I get that. I get what you're saying to an extent. I do. I'm like
I'm
trying
not. I'm
to.
not for these at all. Like I'm not for or against these
Yeah,
things. But like to me, I get why the players would sign off on it because I think the amount of
yeah.
money that they'll get through the course of this deal is probably worth the trade off in terms of like hampering the teams at the very top. To me, it's interesting, as you said, the kind of internecine battles within the ownership groups altogether.
Yeah. So, the second apron now is $17.5 million above the tax level. Those teams also will be limited in terms of their optionality and functionality within roster building as well. And I think this is actually what like annoys me more than anything else within this agreement with like within the ownership battles of it all. So those teams will not have use of the taxpayer or the taxpayer mid-level exception. So they no longer, for instance, will be able to sign Joe Ingles with the Milwaukee Bucks Dante DiVincenzo with the Golden State Warriors. So you won't be able to add to your team basically when you go above this limit above minimum salaried players essentially, or you get the biannual exception. Like I'd imagine that that's a real option for these teams still, although there hasn't been reporting on that one way or another, I guess is maybe the way to put it. Then you also look at the trade rules that are coming into play, and I am trying to pull those up as we speak, where essentially you're not going to be able to utilize cash in trades. So like you can't, trade $5 million for a second round pick into the future, right?
Yeah.
Which is something that a number of teams have started to do in order just to get like second rounders, right? You can't move first round picks in drafts that are 7 years out in the future,
Right.
which again limits your optionality. You now can basically only move 3 first round picks max of your own if you just have all of your own picks and you don't have other, picks that have come in and out. And then finally, you actually can't take on more money that is being sent out in the trade. So like if you're sending out a $15 million player in a trade, you can't then take back $15,001 in
Right.
that trade. Which actually does like significantly limit the optionality of even trades for these teams. I feel like these are quite punitive, if I'm being
Mhm.
completely honest, and
They're
I feel
very
like
punitive.
they are. I feel like I don't love it.
It does put an onus now on. I wonder what it does to the trade market, because it puts an onus on especially these high spending teams to retain their draft picks, right? Like that
It
might
does.
just be their best way to get future talent, right? Not only like not only to help the team like the next season, the season after that, but just to be able to reload down the line as some of the big contracts they gave out age, and probably a few of them will age poorly, but they won't be able to make up for it with someone with the room with the with an exception, signing someone in free agency, or just like using a slot to pick up a bigger contract as we saw like the Warriors did with the D'Angelo Russell contract. So I'm gonna be very curious what it does to picks. Like, will it make them even? Will make them harder to get. We've seen them just like being traded the
Yeah.
last 2 years, like nothing basically. Like, does that change all of a sudden?
My immediate reaction when I saw all of this, and I tweeted this out on Saturday night while I was at the Final Four, and all of this was getting reported. All of this just says to me that the draft is now going to be way more important in team building. Uh, the draft is obviously the primary way to get stars in the NBA still. I mean, you look across the league, Devin Booker was drafted by the Suns. Stephen Curry was drafted by the Warriors. Giannis was drafted by the Bucks. Nikola Jokic was drafted by Denver. Joel Embiid was drafted by the 76ers. Jason Tatum was drafted by the Celtics. You can go on and on and on, right? The draft is still the primary way to get superstars across the league. I know that we live in a free agency and trade driven, content landscape now, but it is still the draft. Like that is the
Yeah.
key. But this, because of these limitations, because of everything that occurred within this new CBA, the draft is even more important. Retaining your draft picks and having cheap guys on salary that can be building blocks for your team earlier and be rotation players for your team earlier. I honestly wonder if, like, frankly, this now puts a value on older draftable players, like more veteran college players that could step in and play a role a little bit quicker. I don't think that is true for like this year or next year, but I think that like 25, 26, 27, 28, that could be true down the road as we settle into this collective bargaining agreement. But more than anything, like these mechanisms to retain players now via earlier extensions, no, limitations on designated rookie extensions, the fact that, you can't, it's now harder to move draft picks, basically. All of this says to me that the draft is more important now than it was a week ago, before this agreement.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right, and I'm curious to see how it changes activity in and around the draft. Will just the inability to trade picks, the need to keep that talent in house, will it change the way the contracts are given out, especially to kind of the middle class of the NBA, and put it to even more of kind of a stars and scrubs basically type of contract structure, right?
Yeah.
Like I know the mid-level exception is going to be growing, and maybe that there will still be teams using that exception specifically, but what does it do to the guys kind of in that particular part of the market? So I'm going to be very curious to see how this all plays out, and probably like 2 years from now, I just feel like we might be seeing a totally different type of behavior by the best teams in the league because of what they have to prioritize and the resources that they don't have anymore.
Yeah, like the middle class of the league is very interesting to me now. Like, do we see a lot of those, Miles Turner style extensions where, he's going to be paid $22 million or whatever it is, $25 million each of the next 2 years? Do we see as many Norman Powells getting like big money extensions? Do we see, frankly, like the entire Clippers roster getting
Right.
all of these random extensions that we have seen? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch play out. My immediate reaction, though, is kind of similar to what you just said. I do really wonder if we go into like a stars and scrubs kind of model here moving forward. I think that's like a real distinct possibility within this thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the NBA probably better than the other leagues has been able to stave that off, just in terms of the
Yeah.
contract allocations across the league, like compared to baseball, compared to the NFL. I don't know much about hockey, I'll be honest, but compared to those other
Hockey
two.
has a pretty thriving, like middle class market
Okay,
still.
all
Yeah.
right, so there you go. So hockey does, but like compared to baseball and to the NFL, I think the NBA has done pretty well in terms of maintaining that middle class. And I don't know if that changes over the next few years because of the CBA. Because if you're just more kind of tied in now, we do have to remember though. We do have to remember it does seem, again, we haven't seen all the final details, but just based on what's been reported and just from what I understand, it does seem that there will be a little more ease of movement and spending for the teams that are just like a little bit above the tax, maybe as an incentive to be willing to go over the tax compared to this previous CBA. So maybe that kind of creates a little more spending on those margins, right? Compared to
Yeah.
creating less spending on the very, very top of this payroll, stratification. But we'll see. Again, we have to see the final details and see how this all plays out.
Yeah, and on some level too, I think the free agency market is like driven by the market on some level too. Like this offseason, there are not stars available. Like
Right.
there just aren't. So like the Rockets
We
have so much cap space and they're going to have to spend it on these middle tier guys if they want to get better.
Well, honestly, the thing that came to mind for me, and tell me what you think of this, like in terms of the immediate impact of what I understand from the CBA, is just thinking it through, is like we might see the further erosion of free agency. If you have longer extensions available for rookies now, you have larger extensions available for veterans, right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
already saw a lot of guys take extensions, especially if you're a star. There's no point to hit free agency. You just take the max extension, and then if you want to bail, you bail later. But now,
Yeah.
do we just see guys sign to extensions and figure out later? And then, what is the value of cap space if that becomes the case? Like we have what all really the teams that have the most cap space this offseason, save for a few, are some of the worst teams in the league.
I think this is a really good point. I think that this is right. And, I was thinking about it in terms of like the draft, but I think you're right to think about it in terms of like the erosion of free agency on some level. On some level, look, like I think Domantas Sabonis's like max extension number now is still like not quite high enough. Like I think
Yeah,
that
I agree.
I think it's like 4 years and like 110
I think
or
it's
something like
yeah,
that.
something like he shouldn't take that.
Yeah, and
Right?
like I think DeJounte Murray's is
Is
still only
around
like,
there.
yeah, a contract. I think it's even less than that, to be honest. Like I think it's like 24 or something like that,
Right.
a year to start. So it is interesting to frame it like that. And I think you're right. Like, and look, here's the other thing too, is the CBA gets going. It wouldn't surprise me if we start to see teams. Well, I guess that they don't have to sign them to lower deals now because the extension number is higher in terms of percentage. But like, I do think that you're right about all of this. Like, I think that teams are probably going to be a little bit more aggressive in trying to extend their players off of the draft. Like, I think that this is a really interesting concept for sure.
Yeah, and we'll see where it goes. Like they did make a restricted free agency easier. I think that was reported somewhere that it's a 10% bump for the qualifying offer, and now you have a day basically to decide whether to sign to match. But
Yeah.
restricted free agency just makes up such a small part of free agency anyway. And we saw the best players get extended, and there's usually kind of those guys at the margins. But maybe they don't hit restricted free agency anymore if you can offer them more money and you can offer longer term, right? And they want to lock that in. I think that's happened in baseball now, so much as you see some of these young players just get offered these huge, like, multi-year contracts that buy out some of their free agent years because they're upfront being guaranteed like $100 million. And if
Yeah.
you're, let's say, an Emmanuel Quickly, right, and you can get offered 5 years, $100 million, maybe that's a little bit below your like true market value if you were to hit free agency. It's hard to turn down $100 million if you've never had
Yeah.
like a real full NBA contract before and you're like 23.